Good morning and welcome to Rise Up, a ministry of Omaha Memorial Seventh-day Adventist Church and School, located at 840 North 72nd Street with Bible school at 9:30, worship 10:45 to noon. I'm McKoy. Here's our pastor and teacher, Delmar Austin.
And welcome this morning to Rise Up. We are so pleased that you have decided to join us today for another discussion of some real-life issues that I believe Christians face in the world today. I know there's a lot of difficult issues that are out there, but fortunately God's Word gives us the principles and values that helps us to make choices even in confusing times. If you've been listening to Rise Up, you know that for several weeks we have been talking about politics and how a Christian should relate to the political world. But the issue we want to talk about today is racism. Now, first and foremost, this is a human problem, not a political problem. There are certainly political considerations in regard to the problem of racism, but we want to try to better understand this attitude of prejudice that is so prevalent in the world today, and what we can do to help this be a better world. So joining me today is Loretta Johnson. She recently stepped down from serving as our lead teacher for the Omaha Memorial Adventist School. Loretta, you are my colleague and my friend. Thank you for joining us today.
You're welcome, Pastor.
The reason I asked you to join me, as you know, was because of your background growing up in South Africa. Now, tell me a little bit about your experience growing up in a country with some significant racial issues.
So first of all, Pastor, I was born and raised in South Africa. I was 22 when I left South Africa to go to Korea, and I left in 1994, which was a very important year for the country because that was the first time that all eligible citizens, regardless of color, were allowed to vote on a national level. So that was a very significant year for us. But I grew up under apartheid.
Did you have a chance to vote in that election, or you were already gone at that point?
Our first election, I believe, was in April of 94, and I did get to vote. My mother and I stood in line for probably over 4 hours waiting to vote for the first time in our lives together. And what's sad is that my mother's 29 years older than me, and I was 22 at the time. I essentially, in a way, kind of got to vote before her age-wise, so she had to wait much longer than I did.
Well, that is quite a memory.
Yes.
About dealing with the racial problems that were a part of your country.
Mm-hmm. And when I was born, that is how life was for us. That's how the political situation was. Apartheid, for those who don't know, is actually an Afrikaans word, which is one of the South African languages, and it means apartness or segregation, basically. Mm-hmm. And as a system of the national white regime at the time, it was instituted around about, I think, 1940s, somewhere around there. And it was a deliberate, designed plan to basically divide and conquer, if I can put it that way.
Let me ask you this. We're from the very first, consciousness. Were you aware of these racial tensions that were a part of your life, or did it take a while to, begin to get a big picture of it and see what was really happening?
Well, as a child, I was not aware because of from my earliest memory as a child, I lived with my grandmother on the farm, and this was my paternal grandmother, and the heritage on my paternal side, my great-grandfather was Irish, and he left Ireland because he was running away from the political situation there. So he came to South Africa, and he married an African woman, a Zulu woman. And so my grandfather was categorized by the government as what we call colored. You're mixed, because one parent was white and one parent was African. So we were considered colored, but my grandmother was Zulu. My grandfather was colored. We had Indians that lived up the street from us, from the farm. And then we had a white man who owned quite a bit of the land in that area. And my brother and I, although living under apartheid, because of the area we lived in, we attended an Indian school because that was the closest school to us on the farm. They didn't have a colored school. And so we didn't experience that segregation until my brother and I moved to live with my dad and my stepmom in the city. And then you really saw it.
So there are several race distinctions that were made. And, it's always interesting to me that the mixture of two races was considered a different race distinction. Mm-hmm. And that made an effect upon your position in society.
It definitely did. And then what's interesting, on my mom's side, my grandfather was Sotho, which is another tribe, and my grandmother was half colored and half Indian. So I'm not sure what that makes me percentage-wise with everything. But what's interesting is that as a colored, you sort of were stuck in the middle, because you weren't white enough to be white and you weren't black enough to be black. And so we had our share of experience under apartheid, and then our share of experience under the new government when we were now democratic, because now with affirmative action, they're trying to right the wrongs of the past and giving privilege or first preference to those who were of native blacks. Mm-hmm. And so there we were, coloreds, stuck in the middle again, because you didn't have an African name, you had an English name, and you didn't have that African accent, and so yeah, we've always been stuck in the middle, kind of.
What were some of the limitations that you realized were upon you because you were in a certain section of society?
So obviously, schools were segregated, churches were segregated, neighborhoods, we had our own little shopping areas in our neighborhoods. We couldn't ride the same buses that white people rode. And what was interesting was the neighborhood I lived in with my dad. We basically had it was a small field. I don't really want to say a park because it didn't have your playground equipment, but it was kind of like a little small field that separated us from the white neighborhood. And it was probably a 2-minute walk from my house into the white neighborhood, where if I wanted to, I could take the white bus, but I knew I wasn't allowed. I would have to walk about 10 minutes to go and get a colored bus. Or what was interesting, though, where we lived, coloreds and Indians kind of mixed. And a little history, Indians were contracted to work in the sugarcane fields in South Africa and were supposed to return when the contract was over, but they chose not to. And so my hometown of Durban has a lot of Indians there. And so we saw that divide and that separateness, your quality of education, of course, as a non-white, which is what we will also refer to, was less than those of whites. The same with housing, amenities that were available, and so forth.
I would think with Indians coming to South Africa, they had already lived in a country where there were distinctions,
yes,
class distinctions, and so they would have some point of reference, at least, in dealing with some of those regulations, I guess, that separated people.
In a way, and I'm sure with you referring to the caste system over there, that probably even continued amongst them in South Africa.
Wow.
Yeah.
You grew up as a Christian in a Christian home. Tell me about, if you saw anything that the church was doing to address the issue of racism. Was the church helpful in any way in healing some of the problems or the tensions of racism in the country?
So specifically with regards to the Adventist church, I don't have too much I can say because I was born and raised Catholic, together with Presbyterian, with my grandmother being Presbyterian when I lived with her. I was about 18 or 19 when I started to attend the Adventist church. But our churches were still separated. You had your colored churches, your Indian churches, your black or African churches, your native blacks, and then you had your white churches. Now, our churches, I would go to an Indian church or a native black church and still felt accepted. I don't remember ever going to a white church. So there was not much that I could say that our church did with regards to the racism, but you did have people who were parts of churches that were involved in different movements with regards to fighting for democracy in South Africa. Yes.
Were there some churches that were quite involved and some churches that were just on the edge, on the outside?
So the native black churches tended to be more involved because they were more disenfranchised. Wow. South Africa, when I was growing up, was this minority of a white group of people that ruled the majority and owned the majority of the land and had the majority of the preferences and advantages. And so you did get people that were involved. So, for example, Desmond Tutu, Archbishop Desmond Tutu was very involved with Nelson Mandela with regards to apartheid in South Africa and the disintegration of it.
That's just a fascinating story to me. I think South Africa is a picture of a contrast, a picture of different groups that are coming together, that are sharing the same land, that are trying to deal with this sense of one group against another group.
Right.
And so it's a really good example to look at when we're talking about the issue of racism.
Yes.
We're going to have to pause for a break at this time, but we are going to come right back and we're going to talk again about some of your experiences, Loretta, as you grew up there in South Africa.
Okay.
Welcome back to Rise Up, a ministry of the Omaha Memorial Seventh-day Adventist Church and School. Now, here's your guest and pastor, Pastor Delmar Austin.
Hey, welcome back to Rise Up on this Saturday morning. We're glad that you have joined us. We really like to try to create a biblical worldview so that we can understand better some of the issues that we really face in this world. And I believe one issue that always has been around and will continue to be is the issue of racism. Racism is something that's very real. And just hearing from the experiences of others and what they have gone through, I think is helpful to us to get a better understanding. And so this morning we've been talking to Loretta Johnson. Loretta grew up in South Africa, and she's been telling us a little bit about her experiences there. Loretta, tell us a little bit more in regards to some of the changes that were taking place. You told us about going to vote for the first time when you were 22, I think?
Yes.
But you in your lifetime there, you in your early lifetime there, you saw a lot of changes, I'm sure, taking place. Tell us a little bit about what was going on there.
One of the changes, and this was major for the country, and I think it did contribute to the healing. I wasn't there to witness it in person, obviously, but there was a commission called the Truth and Reconciliation Committee that was commission that was put together. And the purpose of this was, if I were to put it in my words, was opportunity for confession, for forgiveness, for reconciliation, and for moving on for the betterment of everybody in the country. I do want to preface it with the fact that even though apartheid was officially dismantled starting around about 1990, 1991, as it goes with racism, you may have laws that have been gotten rid of, but the mentality may sometimes still be there, as it is worldwide. It's a global issue, I think. But what was beautiful about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was it allowed people who had committed, if I could call them, political crimes because of the situation at the time, those who were fighting for freedom and those who were trying to maintain nationalism at the time. It allowed for people to confess what they had done, and for those whom they had offended to forgive them. And one story I like to share was this lady whose one and only child, her son, who was killed by the police. This was a black lady, and her son was killed by a white policeman. And so he had to reveal how they had kidnapped her son, how they had tortured him, and how they had killed him. And she's sitting there and she's listening to all of this. And at the end of it all, conversation continues after this confession, and she shares how this was her only child, and she shares what her son would do for her, how he'd come and visit, during the week, and the different things he would do for her, and just the time spent together. And she says to him, "You will now have to take his place because I do not have my son because of you. And these are the things you will now have to do because I no longer have my son." And that always just amazes me with that story, because that woman is evidence of true Christianity. Mm-hmm. The level of forgiveness, I know as a mother, if that were me, I would not want to have anything to do with this man. I wouldn't want to see him thereafter. I wouldn't want him in my presence. I wouldn't want him doing the things my son would have done for me. And I think sometimes this is my little 2 cents. This is what is needed in the United States. There's, I often hear about how there hasn't been an apology by the government to those who were ill-treated and mistreated through racism. And you and I both know, Pastor, as Christians, the only way you can heal is through confession and forgiveness. It is a difficult situation because we're now in 2022, and what happened in this country was, decades and centuries ago. And you do have people who will say, but I didn't do any of that. I didn't commit any of those offenses, Mm-hmm. So why should I suffer for the wrongs of my ancestors or the generations going back? But at some point, I think when we are able to confess and forgive, we're able to therefore heal and move forward in a much better way than currently is in this country, at least.
We were talking about this before this show mm-hmm. today, and I was really impressed by the Truth and Reconciliation Committee
yes.
and what was done there, because it was dealing with the problem of racism mm-hmm. on not just a political level.
Right.
We can make laws that everybody can sit anywhere on the bus. Mm-hmm. We can make laws that schools need to be integrated.
Yes.
There are good laws that can be made mm-hmm. that are more fair mm-hmm. than some of the ways we've done things in the past. But we can't change human hearts
right.
by passing a law.
Right.
But to talk about what happened and to try to bring some healing to that situation is just such a powerful thing. I believe that that's a Christian effort in order to bring people together.
Well, I believe conversation is so important because it allows for us to open up, for us to share. And then it does compel us to understand, because you've got to listen through that conversation. So you're not just having one party doing all the talking, but there's got to be listening. There's got to be going back and forth in that conversation to make clear, do I understand you the way I'm supposed to understand what you have said? And it's just like, Pastor, when it comes to racism, like I've said when we've talked about it in my family, I've said, I'm not a color. God did not make me a color. He made me a person, a human being. We have the human race. And so we've allowed society to create these parameters of what makes a certain race and a group of people and what is considered superior than others. Just like you and I, you are who you are first, and that's who your parents named you. You're Delma Austin, and I'm Loretta Johnson, and we're children of God, And so just because I may have extra melanin, and I didn't ask for it, we weren't allowed to choose, what color it would be. But if we could just look beyond that, and then just remembering from a Christian's point of view, we all come from our original parents, and so we're all family. And so we need to do better.
We do need to do better.
Loretta, I've always heard something that I thought was amazing, that when Jesus came, he came to make all races simply the human race.
Yes.
Yeah. And so, that's to me the way it should be. You made the comment, we'll never solve it. Probably not, but if everybody would love Jesus, it'd be solved.
Amen.
Yeah.
Amen, it would. Well, I believe it would as the Holy Spirit works on our hearts, because we all have growth to do as we choose to follow Christ. You've mentioned, you've told us some things that you've kind of learned through this experience. But let me ask you that question again. Have you learned anything, that just stands out for you about racism from your own personal experience, from what you have gone through?
I want to say with racism, nobody wins.
Yeah.
And it may come across that one group wins, but I think at the end of the day, nobody wins. And there is so much value in diversity. You look at our church and the diversity that's in there, and I think of the blessings that we get to experience with different languages, different cultures, even maybe a different presentation of music through worship and so forth. Because you think about it, we have no idea what's going to be the spoken language in heaven. We have no idea what, worship is going to be like. There isn't going to be a heaven for black people and for white people and for colored people and for Indian people, with me coming from our racial, divisions back in South Africa. There isn't going to be a heaven for different cultural, groups and ethnic groups, because even within your own race, especially in South Africa, within the native blacks, you had the different tribes, and so you have those different ethnic groups. And so we separate along those lines. And so I don't think we win. I think we end up hurting each other. We end up hurting one another, be it intentionally or unintentionally, and it can affect relationships because of allowing racism to some extent to come in,
You brought up about the language in heaven, which I think is very interesting. I've heard that question asked a lot, and the more that I hear it, the more I think it reveals something about the racism that's already there in our hearts. I remember a lot of times I've heard the answer, what language are we going to speak in heaven? People will say, English, because it's the only language that Americans can learn.
Yes.
But really, what if we spoke every language in heaven?
Yes.
Why is it that we have to choose one language?
Right.
God made us with diversity.
Right.
And so maybe some of that thinking is already kind of limited in our heads because we think we have to be this way or that way.
Right.
And God is much more in favor of a bigger picture. Let me ask you another question before we break. Were there any surprises when you came here to the United States? I know you went to Korea first and spent some time.
Mm-hmm.
When you came to the United States, did you find a lot of racial tension? Did you find people getting along any differently than what you'd experienced in South Africa?
So to tell you the truth, before I came to the States, I sort of thought it would be easier here because there would be just two distinctions in my head. That's what I was thinking. And I first came here in 1995. And so I thought with the two distinctions, you're either going to be black or you're going to be white. Oh, and that's so easy. Put me in the black box. That's it, you know? However, it didn't go that way. You'll find that even in this country, there are, even amongst blacks, you've got your mixed, who also kind of feel like, where do they fit in? You have some, I believe it's referred to as colorism. You know, depending on your skin color, those who are darker skinned tend not to be treated as kindly, as nicely, as humanly as they should be. So it was interesting to see that when I came. I have noticed, and I think we'd agree, there's more racial tension now. I've noticed more racial tension now than I did when I first came to the States. When I first came to the States, it was more about, the emphasis was more on my accent. And so there was the realization that I was not from here because of the accent. And so the focus was more on where I was from. And then, of course, there was a few times it was thrown in, oh, you speak English very well. Where did you learn? Group of people and what is considered superior than others.
All sorts of ideas.
You know, just like you and I, you are who you are first.
And racial thinking sometimes. We're going to come back in just a moment and continue with our discussion today about racism with Loretta Johnson.
Good morning and welcome to Rise Up, a ministry of the Omaha Memorial Seventh-day Adventist Church and School. Omaha Memorial is located at 840 North 72nd, with Bible school at 9:30 and worship at 10:45 till noon. I'm Mac McKoy. Here's our pastor and teacher, Delmar Austin.
And welcome back to Rise Up today. You know, we're looking at a tough issue today, racism. You know, no matter, it seems like the progress that we make, sometimes we just slip back again and I think we're actually having a time in this country right now that we're relooking at some of our attitudes regarding racism. So I think that is true. Sometimes we seem to be doing better, and yet there's something deep inside of us that makes us want to think that we're better than somebody else, and to begin to generalize about people in different groups or different categories. So you were telling us a little bit about your experiences here, and you found that there was a fair amount of tension, or at least a fair amount of thinking in regards to racial issues. Is that right?
Yes. And what's interesting was I had a lady say to me, this was an American lady talking about how blacks are treated here in this country, and these were her words to me. She felt that as a black coming from another country, as a foreign black, that foreigners are treated better than blacks that are American from here themselves. And I remember when I heard that, I was saddened by that, because I thought, well, you were born and raised here, you're an American yourself, and that's how you're treated. And I didn't understand that.
Yeah. There's still a lot of hangover from the experiences that people have had as they were growing up. And there were times that were more significant, I believe, in our country. I have memories as a child growing up of watching conflict on television going on that I didn't understand. I was a child, too young,
Right.
and I'd be watching the news, and what they would be showing was some of the events that were happening during the Civil Rights Movement. And they would show people being chased by dogs and people being hosed down with fire hoses and people clubbing each other. And I couldn't understand why all that turmoil was going on. And until I was an older age, and I began to see some of these issues that were there.
And what you described, similar events happened in South Africa as far as, people being beaten up and those who were involved in protesting, wanting to make a change for everybody in the country to have the right to vote. The same thing happened in South Africa. They initially tried with peaceful, nonviolent means. That didn't work. Then it went to protests and demonstrations. And sadly, there were some incidences where people were demonstrating and they were killed, by the police for not dispersing from these demonstrations and so forth. And the things that were being protested were basic human rights, for education, housing, and so forth.
You look at this big spectrum and you see problems every place in the world. There's problems that have to do with racism. One of the points that I think we ought to make as we talk about this is racism is a problem in the church too. We're not immune because we have professed to follow Jesus Christ. There is still some feelings in our hearts at times. And that's why I think it's important when we talk about this to address the issue that, it's still going on at times right in the Church of Jesus Christ. I remember reading the experiences of Philip Yancey when he was growing up. He's one of my favorite evangelical writers. He grew up in Atlanta, Georgia, and he almost left religion totally because of the racist attitudes that were part of his church and the racial practices that were part of it. And I think that this has affected a number of Christians that say, we see so much wrong in the church that, how can I be a Christian? How can I be a follower of Christ if some of this is allowed or at least tolerated within the church? I guess one thing that I would like to remind people is that one of the first big issues that the Christian church had to face was the issue of racism.
Right.
The
Prejudice.
Prejudice.
Yes.
The problem with Jews and Gentiles. So, some people may not say that's racism, but I believe it is. It's a prejudiced attitude towards a different group of people, a different culture. And it's not just religious. It's much more than that.
Yeah.
It's a feeling that this group is inferior to us. And I think that definitely was happening in the Christian church at the time that it gets established. It starts out with basically Jewish believers, individuals who have heard and seen Jesus Christ and choose to follow him. But it's not long. In those first chapters of Acts, it's not long until Gentiles are becoming believers. And it is knowing how to deal with the tensions that are between Jews and Gentiles. Right. Because for many people that have grown up in the Jewish faith, the Gentile is unclean.
Yes.
And I cannot mingle with him. I cannot do even the normal things of life. He can't come in my home. I can't even eat with him. And so this heightens this tension that happens. And I believe there are two individual racial thinking that sometimes. That we're going to come back in just a moment and continue with our discussion today about racism with
you
can't choose two bigger names than that out of the early Christian church.
Good morning and welcome to Rise Up, a ministry of the Omaha Memorial Seventh-day Adventist Church and School. Omaha Memorial is located at 840 North 72nd, with Bible school at 9:30 and worship at 10:45 till noon. I'm Matt McKoy. Here's our pastor and teacher, Delmar Austin.
And Peter is. And welcome back to Rise Up today. We're looking at a tough issue today: racism. No matter it seems like the progress that we make, sometimes we just slip back again, and and I think we're actually having a time in this country right now that we're relooking at some of our attitudes regarding racism. So I think that is true. Sometimes we seem to be doing better, and yet there's something deep inside of us that makes us want to think that we're better than somebody else, and to begin to generalize about people in different groups or different categories. So you were telling us a little bit about your experiences here. There's a knock on the door downstairs. You found that there was a fair amount of tension, or at least a fair amount of thinking in regards to racial issues. Is that right?
Yes.
And he is
and what's interesting was I had
messengers to Peter.
A lady say to me, this was an American lady talking about how blacks are treated here in this country, and these were her words to me. She felt that
learns from it, I think,
as a black coming from another country, as a foreign black, that foreigners are treated better than blacks that are American from here themselves. And I remember when I heard that, I was saddened by that, because I thought, well, you're born and raised here, you're an American yourself, and that's how you're treated, and I didn't understand that.
And unclean is there's still a lot of hangover from the experiences that was something people have had as they were growing up. Was a big thing for Jewish believers. There were times that were more significant, I believe, in our country. I have memories as a child growing up of watching conflict on television going on that I didn't understand. I was a child, too young, and I'd be watching the news, and I think there is an awakening, and what they would be showing was some of the events that were happening during the Civil Rights Movement, and they would show people being chased by dogs, and people being hosed down with fire hoses, and people clubbing each other. And I couldn't understand why all that turmoil was going on. And until I was an older age, and I began to see some of these issues that were there. Because I believe
and what you described,
is common as sin.
Similar events happened in South Africa, as far as people being beaten up, and those who were involved in protesting, wanting to make a change for everybody in the country to have the right to vote. The same thing happened in South Africa. They initially tried with peaceful, non-violent means,
because it's a preferential treatment.
That didn't work.
Then
it went to protests and demonstrations. And sadly, there were some incidences where people were demonstrating and they were killed, by the police for not dispersing from these demonstrations and so forth. And the things that were being protested were basic human rights, for education, housing, and so forth.
And we've I think we all have our own
look at this
prejudices
big
that God
and
has
you see problems
to work
every
on
place
us,
in the world.
regardless of
problems
our race,
that have to do with racism.
and our upbringing, and
one
where
of the points that I think we ought to make as we talk about this is
those
racism
that
is a problem in the
us
church too.
From one another,
we're not immune,
especially as Christians,
because we have professed to follow Jesus Christ.
You're my brother.
There is still some
it doesn't matter
some
what color
feelings
we are
in our hearts
and where we come
at
from.
times.
our place in life in society.
And that's why I think it's important when we talk about this to address the issue.
If you and I are not getting along, one of us is not going to be there. Both of us are not going to be there. And I don't want it to be me that I'm not there.
I remember reading
the
experiences
and it's got to be
of
genuine, not
Yancey
fake.
when he was
It's
growing
got to be
up.
the real
He's
thing.
one of my favorite evangelical writers. He grew up in Atlanta, Georgia.
We're going to have to take another
and
break.
He almost
we're going
left
to be back for one more time
religion.
to talk a little
Totally.
more about
because
racism.
of the racist attitudes
Right.
that were a part of his church and the racial practice.
Good morning and welcome back to Rise Up, a ministry
And
of the
I
Omaha
think that
Memorial
this has
Seventh-day
affected
Adventist Church
a
and
number of
School.
Christians
Omaha
that
Memorial
say,
is located
we see
at
so much
840
wrong
North
in the
72nd
church
and Bible School
that,
from 9:30 to 10:30 every Saturday.
How can I be
and
a
then
Christian?
worship
How can I be a
begins
follower of
at
Christ?
10:45 to noon.
Some of this is
I'm Mac
allowed or
McKoy
at
for
least tolerated
KCRO.
in the church.
Here's our pastor
I guess
and teacher,
one thing that
Delmar
I would like
Austin.
to remind people is that one of the first big
And
issues
thank you again for
that the
joining
Christian
us
church
today
had to face
on Rise Up.
was the issue of
We've been,
racism.
Right.
Talking
Prejudice.
here this
The
morning
prejudice.
with Loretta
Yes.
Johnson.
The problem
Loretta's
with
from
Jews
South
and
Africa,
Gentiles.
and she has
Some people
really
may
good
not say that's
insights as we're
racism, but
talking
I
about
believe it
the
is.
It
issues
is.
It's a
of
prejudiced
racism.
attitude towards a
Racism
different
is
group
not
of
just
people,
in
a different
South
culture,
Africa. It's all
and it's
over
not
the
just
world.
religious.
And
it's
it
much
was
more
even
than
all
that.
the way
Yeah.
back
It's
in
a
the time of the early
feeling
church.
that this
Yes.
group
as
is
the church
inferior
was trying
Right.
to come
to
together.
us.
And
I think
one of
that
the
definitely
amazing
was happening
signs
in
of
the
what God
Christian
was
church,
doing in the early church
at the
was
time
the fact
that it gets
that he was dealing
established.
with those
It
issues,
starts out
and he was helping
with
the church to come
basically
together as one
Jewish believers,
so they could accomplish the
individuals who
Yes.
have heard
of
and
taking
seen
the gospel
Jesus
to
Christ
the world.
and choose to
Because
follow
back
him.
at that time,
but it's not long.
Jews and
In those
Gentiles,
first
which
chapters
is
of Acts, it's
what
not
was
long
happening
until
in the early Christian
Gentiles
church.
are
Jews
becoming
and
believers.
Gentiles were
And it is knowing
as divided
how
as you could imagine.
to
there was
deal
a lot of hatred that
with
was going
the
on. There's a lot of
with the tensions
things that took
that are
place in the
between
first
Jews and
century
Gentiles.
AD.
Right.
Just devastating
Because
things
for
of
many
violence
people that have grown up in the
between Jews
Jewish
and
faith,
Gentiles. And yet at
the
the same
Gentile
time,
is
God
unclean.
working,
Yes.
bringing
And I
people
cannot
into
mingle with
a
him. I cannot
relationship
do
with
even the
Jesus
normal
Christ.
things of life.
And,
He can't come in
as
my
they come
home.
together,
I can't even eat
they
with
form
him.
a body
And
who is
so
one
this
and
heightens
functioning
this
in this
tension
world.
that
In fact,
happens.
functioning quite successfully.
And I believe there are two
I talked
individual
about
racial
that
thinkings sometimes.
that
We're
God
going to
is
come back
using in a
in
very
just a
special way.
moment and
There's also
continue
the
with our
Apostle
discussion
Paul and the
today
Apostle Paul.
about
You know,
racism
I don't- you
with
can't
Loretta
choose
Johnson.
two bigger names than that out of the early Christian church.
Good morning and welcome to Rise Up, a ministry of the Omaha Memorial Seventh-day Adventist Church and School. Omaha Memorial is located at 840 North 72nd, with Bible School at 9:30 and worship at 10:45 till noon. I'm Mac McKoy. Here's our pastor and teacher, Delmar Austin.
And Peter is,
And welcome back to Rise Up today. We're looking at a tough issue today, racism. No matter, it seems like the progress that we make, sometimes we just slip back again and and I think we're actually having a time in this country right now that we're re-looking at some of our attitudes regarding racism. So I think that is true. Sometimes we seem to be doing better, and yet there's something deep inside of us that makes us want to think that we're better than somebody else, and to begin to generalize about people in different groups or different categories. So you were telling us a little bit about your experiences here, and you found that there was a fair amount of tension, or at least a fair amount of thinking in regards to racial issues. Is that right?
Yes, yes.
and
what's interesting was I had a lady say to me, this was an American lady talking about how blacks are treated here in this country. And these were her words to me. She felt that as a black coming from another country, as a foreign black, that foreigners are treated better greater than blacks that are American from here themselves. And I remember when I heard that, I was saddened by that, because I thought, well, you're born and raised here, you're an American yourself, and that's how you're treated, and I didn't understand that.
Unclean is
There's still a lot of hangover from the experiences that people have had as they were growing up. And there were times that were more significant, I believe, in our country. I have memories as a child growing up of watching conflict on television going on that I didn't understand as a child, too young, and I'd be watching the news, and what they would be showing was some of the events that were happening during the Civil Rights Movement, and they would show people being chased by dogs and people being hosed down with fire hoses and people clubbing each other, and I couldn't understand why all that turmoil was going on, and until I was an older age, and I began to see some of these issues that were there.
Because I believe,
and what you described, similar events happened in South Africa, as far as people being beaten up, and those who were involved in protesting, wanting to make a change for everybody in the country to have the right to vote. The same thing happened in South Africa. They initially tried with peaceful, non-violent means,
because it's a preferential treatment.
that didn't work.